Welcome to Immigration Uncovered, the DocketWise video podcast. I'm James Pittman. This is episode 36, and we're here with David Lesperance, who is the founder of Lesperance and Associates. It is a law firm. David is based in Poland. He has offices in Montreal and Gibraltar, and they deal with citizens of any nation who are looking for potentially second residencies or second domiciles or second citizenships and beyond. David, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here, James.
Okay. Well, we've talked a little bit about you and I had a little pre-conversation. We talked about three essential scenarios that we're going to use as our framework for going into our discussion today. And the three scenarios are: the first one is where someone wants to go abroad for a limited period of time, but they're not planning to stay long enough to really be a tax resident in a second country. That's our first scenario that we'll go into. Second scenario we'll get to after that is where you are going to go abroad. You're going to be residing long enough so that you're going to need to have tax planning considerations. You may be acquiring a second citizenship. You are, however, not planning to give up your primary citizenship. And then the third scenario is when you're planning to leave your country of origin or your main country of citizenship for good. And then, especially for U.S. citizens, that introduces a whole other set of considerations regarding taxation, the expat tax and foreign tax compliance and all of that. So we're going to talk about those three. So having said that, let's go to our first scenario. So David, what sort of scenarios do you encounter when someone is planning to go abroad for a limited period of time, and what are the considerations involved in advising them?
James, I've been using this analogy that is a bit dangerous for a Canadian, for my American clients to say, imagine you live in a wildfire zone. So what are your wildfire concerns? Well, it may be taxation, it may be gun violence and your children doing active shooter drills, it may be rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, it may be just, tired of political polarization. And so what do you do when you're in a wildfire zone? Well, I'm going to fight the fire. I'm going to vote and I'm going to register my friends. I'm going to donate. That's great. But no chief drops a crew into a hot zone without having an exit strategy. And so that would be a second residence, second citizenship, and then a fire escape plan. So the first one that you mentioned is what we call the go bag option. There's been a hurricane, there's been an earthquake, or, I have clients that are planning to be outside of the U.S. during the election season. As you said, they're going to be abroad somewhere longer than a visitor. They don't know quite how long, but they suspect it will be less than the normal 6 months when they would become tax resident in another jurisdiction. And so for a lot of clients, that's assurance of events that they think may happen or that they have a good chance of happening. I have everything from, I've got some clients in California, same-sex couple who, as a result of Dobbs, are worried that, same-sex marriage may be next. And they just want the comfort of that insurance policy so that they know just because you have fire insurance and a fire escape plan doesn't mean you need to use them. It just means that if you smell the smoke, you've got options.
Okay. And what are the considerations that you have to take into account? So you have considerations of permission to reside abroad. What goes into making a choice of country? And are there any tax considerations when you are? So you're going for a limited period of time. The idea is you're not going to stay long enough to be subject to taxation.
Yes. Unless you're going to Eritrea, where no other country taxes based on citizenship.
Okay.
In fact, no other country ties immigration status with tax status. So you are, for example, a U.S. person for tax purposes if you get the immigration status of a green card. You don't if you, for example, get a leave to remain in the U.K. or permanent residence in Canada or a work permit in Germany, etc. So when we look at how you acquire the fire insurance, a lot of it depends on your background. Do you have claim to a European citizenship, European country citizenship? That doesn't mean that you need to go back to the country of your ancestors. In fact, with an EU country citizenship, you can go to any one of 27 countries. Can you take advantage of, for example, a trade agreement between Canada and the U.S.? A lot of our go bag options that we use are people who have U.S. companies, they're senior executives. We create a Canadian subsidiary. We get a work permit for them under an intracorporate transfer. Other countries have what are called residence or golden visa by investment programs. As I mentioned to you before we started talking, is I act on behalf of my clients. I don't act on behalf of some fund manager in Portugal or, some Caribbean island. So if we have to go with the residence or citizenship by investment, I actually return the commission back to the client so they know that I'm acting in their best interest and not in a conflicted manner. The key for any developing of any of the fire escape plans is it's got to be a place that works, and I like to say sells at the breakfast table. Occasionally I'll get a client who said, look, I've been sued, I've been audited, I've gone through a divorce, move me somewhere with no lawyers and no tax system. And so my glib answer is, no problem, we'll move you to Pitcairn Island. Only 38 people on Earth have decided that's where they want to live. Oh, no. I want schools, I want hospitals, I want airports, I want this, I want that. And it's like, okay, so let's move you to a place which is going to fulfill all those business and personal needs for all the family members and do so in a tax-efficient manner.
Right, so it's interesting. So the fact that you're going to acquire residency or you're going to acquire citizenship even does not necessarily trigger being taxed under the laws of that jurisdiction. You've just said that it's really only the United States and maybe Eritrea who just tax you just based on the fact that you have their citizenship. So you can get the second citizenship, you can get a residence permit, but you're not necessarily triggering a tax requirement. But it's still a good time, I think, to talk about FBAR and FATCA because if you're a U.S. citizen, you're going abroad even for a period of several months. You may find it advantageous, depending on what you have to do abroad, to open a bank account. I mean, do you find that the FBAR and FATCA come into play even for short-term residents abroad?
So an FBAR is a foreign bank account report that you have an account in a foreign bank with a greater than $10,000 transaction within a year. You have an obligation to file a particular form with the Treasury Department. Not a tax liability. It's simply that you are you have this obligation to report. And if you don't report, there's quite onerous penalties. So there's lots of people who thought, well, I have a cottage in Canada. I'm going to open up a bank account with, a Canadian bank to pay my property bill and my, my gardener or whatever. And, when they add it up over the period of time, or they have a child who's going to school abroad and they open up an account for that child. And they said, well, I don't want them spending it all at the pub, so I'm going to have a co-signing on that. And not only does the child abroad have the obligation for the foreign bank account report, but so does the co-signing American. FATCA, it was an interesting piece of legislation that I contend was brought in. So if you go back before FATCA, there's something called the qualified intermediary regime. And what it was the United States realized, hey, we're the world reserve currency here, so any financial institution on Earth is going to want to have U.S. correspondent banking relations. And in fact, we have 30 to 35% of the world's equity market, so any financial brokerage house internationally is going to want to access the U.S. market for all of their clients. So the U.S. government had signatories directly with each of these financial institutions called qualified intermediaries. Well, some of these banks, and UBS was not the only, but they were the first one to be kind of outed, were not complying with the QI regime. And the QI regime obligated them to search through all their clients, report, withhold, and remit on U.S. persons who had accounts, brokerage accounts, bank accounts with that institution. UBS was outed, major case from Credit Suisse, HSBC, Vaglin, all kinds of banks all over the world were outed. And so That then gave an opportunity for the U.S. government to bring in FATCA, which was kind of QI on steroids. So now, for example, I, as a Canadian who opens up a bank account, I live in Europe, I open up a local bank account, I've never been a U.S. person, they still have to do FATCA compliance. So if I was a U.S. person, citizen, green card holder, substantial presence, I'd have to sign a W-9. If not, I sign something called a W-8 BEN, which means that they don't have to report, withhold, or remit. Now that these financial institutions are going through all their existing and new clients and determining whether they're U.S. persons, they're gathering a lot more information. That then other countries, said, well, gee, okay, they're out there trolling everybody. The Americans are taking the tuna out of the net. Let's get our Kiwi or Canadian or British or French dolphins. So that then gave birth to something called the Common Reporting Standard. And so CRS is now, a new program. So when going back to our fire escape plan, even if you say, I'm going to have a go bag option and I'm going to choose Portugal and I'm going to go for a golden visa, still have that program. You can still buy real estate in Portugal. You just can't use it as a vehicle to get a residence permit. You can get the residence permit if you're going to spend more than 6 months there without making an investment under something called a D7, but let's just say that they're getting it as a go bag option. And that's 500,000 euros, so they would decide which fund they wanted to invest in. Well, they would have to open up a bank account, where they go through the screening process in Portugal, deposit that 500,000 in there, and then they would invest in the fund. Well, even though they're not tax resident in Portugal, because they're not spending 6 months plus in Portugal, they've got an FBAR account. Even if that account just had 500,000 for a week before they bought the fund, there's an FBAR requirement there. And of course, they've just bought a PFIC because they're an American who now has a passive foreign investment corporation. Sorry. Well, I went acronym there on you.
So am I correct that the FBAR is really a burden on the individual and the FATCA is really a burden on the banking institutions?
You're correct. So the banks have an obligation for their existing or new customers to determine whether they are U.S. persons. And now a lot of institutions in countries which are in CRS signatory countries, for example, the one I live in, also requires the bank to collect information for CRS purposes.
And a lot of the banks don't want to be bothered with those requirements, I understand. So there are some banks that just don't want to deal with U.S. citizens living abroad. Is that correct?
Correct. So when it first came out, there were some banks that were quite used to dealing with Americans. So, for example, the Canadian banks. So they were still accepting U.S. clients. Other banks said, oh my God, the compliance cost for an American, as opposed to, the Kiwi behind them or the Brit or the Frenchman or the South African. I don't have to do any of this stuff. And so they just made a decision, unless it was going to be a big enough client where it generated a sufficient amount of fees to justify the hassle, they would just say, yes, American, off you go. It's been, FATCA's been around for quite a while now. And so you're seeing more and more the major institutions. I just answered a question on Chorus. Is there any bank in the world that will deal with Americans? It's like, oh, yes. What country are you in? So the myth that no bank will offer you that or no bank will give you a mortgage, etc., that may have been true kind of when FERT came in. But now institutions are saying, okay, well, we'll deal with Americans. We may charge them more in fees because of the hassle, or now that we have spent the money to deal with Americans, the marginal cost of adding one more American customer, is not worth it. So we want to be able to get at that market.
Okay. Now, I guess we can segue into our second scenario. So our second scenario is you're going abroad and you are going to be you're staying long enough to where you're going to be subject to tax considerations. So what's your framework for advising clients in these types of situations?
Well, one thing for those who are getting a little overwhelmed on the information is I do have white papers on the integrated tax and immigration issues for Americans living abroad and Americans expatriating. So we'll kind of fly at 30,000 feet. So if the client is saying, I'm going to live abroad, the real key first discussion is them really figuring out what are the family needs, what's particular for that family. Then talking to me, and I can then go through, here are all the different jurisdictions that will meet those needs. Some people like a certain type of weather. Some people want to be in an English-speaking environment. Some people want to be, in a particular time zone or close to a particular time zone. Some people want to, New Zealand's a beautiful place, but it's a 14-hour flight from LAX, so you don't go there for the weekend. So it's understanding kind of what is it that really works for you, and then understanding, okay, what do I need to live there? Oh, I have a lineage citizenship. I've got 27 instant choices. I don't need to deal with any immigration issue. I've got the right to live in any one of these 27 EU countries. Other jurisdictions, I have to get some type of immigration permission to live there. And we look at, again, what's the best that fits your situation, what's the cheapest. Again, if we have to go with one of these golden visa programs, then, again, I'm flying the commission back to them so they know the advice. I'm trying to get what's best for them, not what's paying me the highest commission. And so the first step, really understanding the family and your situation, narrowing it down to jurisdictions, and then saying, okay, here's the immigration path, here's the tax path. Does it have a tax treaty with the United States, for example? And so, what kind of income do you have? What kind of, warning technical term, stuff do you have? Because a lot of clients these days, they'll have 401ks, and they have charitable remainder trusts, and they have, super Roths, grats, all kinds of stuff. So how is that going to be treated in the other jurisdiction?
Okay, so you've got a couple general pathways. You might have the citizenship by descent pathway. You might have the citizenship by investment pathway. And then, that can be I know some of the countries, it's just a straightforward, maybe donation to their sovereign wealth funds. Sometimes it's an investment in real estate. Are there other than those two main ones?
Sure. So there's digital nomads.
Okay.
That's quite common. Sometimes we can get it because you are somebody who they have retiree or self-employed is an option in some countries. They may give it to you because you are a young, brilliant person they need your particular occupation there, or you're starting up a company, a startup visas. There's a number of different paths. And so we really look at, first off, what's the country? And then what are our options? And what's the best option for you in that particular country?
Okay, now, you're going to have U.S. taxation, and then you're going to have foreign taxation. So you have to look at what tax treaties exist. And can you introduce us a little bit as to the considerations and how that works? You're going to be taxed on your U.S. on your worldwide income in the U.S. And then how does that play out? What sorts of scenarios do people encounter?
Well, tax lawyers have their own kind of version of a Hippocratic oath, which is for doctors is do no further damage. For tax lawyers, it's pay no further tax. So you try to look at, in tax treaties, what will come into play. Foreign tax credits. You may have reduced rates, withholding tax rates. You may have different foreign earned income exemptions, foreign housing exemptions. So you have to figure out kind of what are the types of income you have. Is that passive? Is that active? Are you going to be employed in the local jurisdiction? Are you going to be employed outside of that jurisdiction? So we look at kind of all the interplays, and then different jurisdictions. For example, if we look at just let's look at a couple of different of places that Americans often go to. Canada. Oh, it's a high tax country. Well, Canada doesn't have gift tax, estate tax, or wealth taxes. Okay. So what about the income and capital gain? Again, there are pre-immigration planning that you can do to reduce and in some case completely eliminate the taxation on the non-Canadian source income. Oh, okay. I have, health coverage there. I can get that, but I want something better. Well, you can still get, you can still go to the Mayo Clinic. You can still go to all the places in the States that you would have available to you anyway. In fact, you can get insurance now at a cheaper rate for that because kind of for the catastrophic stuff, you've got the Canadian healthcare system. Okay. So it's looking at the delta between the two. Other jurisdictions have what are called remittance or what are sometimes called non-dom systems. The UK has one right now, may not have one by April of next year. But Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. Other jurisdictions have lump sum. Italy and Greece, it's 100,000 euros a year for a high net worth client, and that's whether you make $1 or 100 million. Well, I had one client who said, 100,000, that's what I pay my accountant every year. That's great. And so, and you don't have to worry about depreciation. Should I buy or lease a car? Is this dinner deduct a business expense? You don't have to worry about any of that. You just, it's 100K a year. For a high net worth or ultra high net worth client, that's great. For the average person, it's not. So understanding kind of what works for you and what's going to be most tax efficient for you. And when the numbers start kind of getting higher, then that's when people start really looking at the third option, which is expatriation.
Okay, but before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about now, there's no limit to the complexity. I mean, when you start talking about the concerns and the different strategies that high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals might need to employ, it can get as complicated as, there's no limit. So, but for, some of the more typical examples of people, they might have some considerations. Like suppose they have their retirement accounts in U.S. Brokerage accounts. Now, if you move abroad and you are spending most of the year abroad, would you need to move your U.S. accounts to an international institution or an institution in the country where you are?
Well, that's a question that you really have to look at is for the broker on securities compliance, because now their customer is non-resident. Not resident in the United States. So now you've got, SEC issues to deal with there. And so different institutions handle it in different ways. Some of them, move your account to a non-U.S. brokerage. You may still like that person in Wichita who kind of understands your risk return and your profile. They can give advice, but that account is actually now based at Fidelity in the UK as opposed to Fidelity in Oklahoma. And so that's one of the things. In some jurisdictions and with some financial institutions, that's not possible. And I'm seeing more and more of, there used to be people who'd be cute and try to have like a U.S. cell phone number and things like that. But now there's a lot of pressure on the brokerages to make sure that they are complying. And so you're finding more and more, those types of accounts closing. For pensions, interestingly, just because you no longer live, or even if you've given up U.S. citizenship, you still have entitlement to Social Security. That depends on whether you paid in for a sufficient number of quarters, not where you're resident or where you happen to be a citizen of at the time that you're eligible for it. Medicare is different. That's based upon residence in a particular state. So if you're living abroad, you're not meeting the residence requirements for Nebraska or California or wherever you were getting Medicare or Medicaid. And so one of the big considerations that we do for a lot of clients is medical insurance. And so I refer them again to an outside medical broker, and they say, okay, what are you looking for? You can have everything from, if I break my leg on Kilimanjaro, I want to be hell lifted off, to I'll pay my local dentist and my local doctor. I just want kind of catastrophic major medical stuff. And so, and that's a cost that they also put into the calculation for living abroad.
But there are a number of countries where, under a lot of these programs, you would probably be eligible for their public healthcare systems. Do any examples stand out? I mean, let's say for, retirees who might be very concerned about, moving abroad and the need to have access to a high quality healthcare system. Are there any examples that stand out as being good places that they might consider?
So there are a couple of jurisdictions that people don't really think about. For example, Cayman has has made itself a medical tourism jurisdiction. So previously, if you had some kind of serious thing, it was like, when's my first flight to Miami? Now you can not only have that treated if you're a resident in Cayman, they're actually bringing in people. Mexico has similar things, Costa Rica, etc. Those are popular destinations for kind of retirees. You're quite right. In Europe, all the European countries have some type of, in the UK they call it NHS, some type of public health system. Where I live right now in Poland has a public health system. Poland's also a medical tourism destination. There are 6 private hospitals in the city I live in.
Well, out of curiosity, I'm just curious. How much lower are medical costs in Poland versus, let's say, Canada, the U.S.? Are we talking about 30% lower, 40% lower?
So I use something called SwissMed. There's Bupa and some of the popular ones. For our dentist, for example, so the Polish zloty is basically 4 Polish zloty to the U.S. dollar. So I'll give kind of the equivalent U.S. dollars. For my teeth cleaning, it's $28. For I needed a bridge, that was $200. I had an operation. Again, probably a little too personal, but it was basically 1/10 of the cost. My brother in Canada needed some dental work, came to Poland, you have to understand, the dentist's office we're going to, it's a dentist that does the cleaning. The operations are, the equipment is like state of the art. Here's a good example. I have twins, 10-year-old twins. My wife, that's considered a high risk pregnancy. The OB-GYN that we had here, and we live in Gdynia, Gdansk area on the Baltic. We went to a leading guy in the waiting room were Saudis, Russians, Brits, etc. An old friend of ours, an American, we didn't use, but she wanted to do IVF. She had tried it in New York, London. She now lived in Dubai. She was getting pretty desperate and said, okay, well, why don't you come here? We'll have this guy is world renowned. He'll come in. She came in and he said, okay, give me your name, date of birth. Oh yeah, I gave the second opinion on your New York one. Okay. She tried it, 1 shot, pregnant, got a little girl now. So it's really understanding, will you get that same medical coverage in Guernsey? You really have to kind of decide where you're going, what fits. That's part of that breakfast table discussion.
Let me just ask another kind of specific question. When you're talking about availing yourselves of benefits in the U.S., like Medicare, for example, depends on state residency. I mean, do you actually, like, if you maintain a residence, if you maintain a home in the U.S., but you're really living most of the year abroad, is that sufficient, or do you actually have to be physically present?
That's kind of a little beyond what I deal with. You'd have to talk to somebody who's an expert in Medicare and Medicaid.
All right, the thought just popped into my mind. But let's move on to our third scenario, which is people who are leaving for good. Now we need to talk about the whole process of renunciation of citizenship, and we'll talk about it with respect to the U.S., obviously, because that's most of our listener base. So let's do that first. So first of all, what are the considerations someone needs to think through to determine whether or not to renounce their citizenship?
Well, they need to have another citizenship in place. In theory, you could do it to be stateless, but you don't want to be stateless. In the hundreds I've done in the 34 years since I did my first U.S. expatriation, I've never had anybody that wanted to be stateless. So how do you have that other citizenship? Well, you may have it, like, for example, Eduardo Saverin of Facebook immigrated and got U.S. citizenship. Later on, still had his Brazilian citizenship. You may have had somebody who had dual citizenship because of their parentage or where they were born, and so they may already have dual citizen. And when I say dual citizen, it's really multiple citizenships. Most people just have two, hence the term dual citizenship. Some people have moved and have lived abroad long enough to become naturalized in that other country. And some people may have claim to a lineage citizenship from a relative kind of further abroad, further along. And some people may do the citizenship by investment. Why do people consider expatriation? Well, some people do it because they've been, yes, I'm an American, and now as a result of FATCA, all of a sudden my bank is asking questions. I didn't think I was an American. My mother was American, but I never applied for an American passport. I've been to Disney World, but I've never lived or worked there. Why would I consider they did know about citizenship-based taxation. They thought, well, my parents never registered me. Well, under U.S. law, if you fit the fact scenario, you're an American from your first breath.
Of law, right? Regardless of whether you ever acquired a document to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, registering or applying for a passport is just advising the U.S. government of an existing state of fact.
Right.
And it's beyond what we're talking about now. But on the other side, you've got a lot of people who got green cards who thought when their permanent resident card expired, they ceased to be a green card holder. And they think, well, so they tell their accountant, I'm no longer a green card holder. Oh, great, you're not a U.S. person anymore. And they fail to file. And then they come back to the airport and the person says, you've been gone a long time. I'll let you in if you sign this little I-407 voluntary relinquishment, and not realizing that may be a tax event when they do that. But anyway, the motivation for some clients who've never lived in the United States or long ago left is they just want to uncomplicate their lives. They don't want to deal with PFICs and FBARs and all of those things. So I'll call that, the grandmother in Calgary idea. So when FATCA came in, we had a rush of people that did that. You then have people who say, okay, I'm going to do it for tax purposes. And it tends to be in two realms. One is the people who are high income who say, I'm trying to get, net closer to gross by Q4 of next year.
Yes.
So then you have people who have a big liquidity event. So for example, I'm a Silicon Valley founder. I've got my founder's shares. Eduardo Saverin would be a perfect example. There's going to be a liquidity event, an IPO at some point in the future. I want to pay a lower tax. We'll talk about that tax in a few minutes. Now, and enjoy the increase in value of the POP on the IPO outside of U.S. tax. Then you have a state tax-driven people. They tend to be ultra high net worth. Now, why? Because the unified credit is increasing so dramatically. So you're talking about 12.7, and if you've got a couple, you're 27.4 million in exemption. And so you're really talking about people, 30 million plus who are looking at that. And we'll talk about the planning they need to do because of the inheritance tax on expatriation. So those are the motivators. And so now let's look into the difference if you're the little old lady in Calgary versus the Silicon Valley founder or the ultra high net worth. The U.S. looks at the day that you give up your U.S. citizenship, relinquish, we'll talk in a bit about the process on that, but as of that day, or if you have a long-term green card, 8 out of the last 15 years, you had green card status, not that your permanent resident card expired. And if that's issued for 10 years, so you've got a lot of people who inadvertently trigger the long-term green card because they've had their green card for more than 10 years. Anyway, if as of that date you fit one of three tests, are you worth more than 2 million worldwide net worth? looking at your federal tax paid, not the taxable income, not the amount of tax you paid state and federal and city in New York, but the federal tax paid. Take that number for the last 5 years, add it up, divide by 5. Is that number more than right now 192,000? That number increases with inflation. So, or can you not certify that you've been tax compliant for the last 5 years? Well, why would that be? Well, because you didn't know you had to file a U.S. tax return, or you thought you lost your U.S. tax filing obligation when your permanent resident card expired. And so we'll get a lot of clients who either inadvertently or advertently did not or cannot certify that. And so we send them through a remedial action to update that so they can certify that. Now, what if the answer is yes to net worth, or it's one or the other, or the federal tax bill? You are what's called a covered expatriate.
Yes.
Which means that you now have the expatriation tax regime applying to you. 2 types. First, 877A, that's the exit tax. That's the deemed disposition. You're deemed to have sold at fair market value your worldwide assets and triggering unrealized capital gains as of that date. There is an exemption on the amount of capital gain that you pay. That increases with every year with inflation. I believe it's $832,000 right now. So you don't pay on the first $832,000 of capital gain, unrealized capital gain, but you pay whatever federal, state, and city level on every dollar above that. The other tax, which people don't really talk about much, is 2801, which is the inheritance tax. Estate tax is paid by the estate. You as the heir, or if you're getting a gift, the beneficiary or the recipient of the gift, get that net of gift or estate tax. If you are a covered expatriate and you are leaving it to U.S. person heirs, you have passed that liability, 40% tax liability, onto the recipient. Now, they haven't even created the forms yet. This was passed the HARD Act 2008, 16 years ago. They still haven't created the form for 2801 for that recipient actually, but the liability is still there. The law is still there. And at some point, they'll get around to do it.
How does that play out in reality? I mean, what do people in that situation do?
If they retain proper counsel, they would set aside that tax liability at the time of the bequest or gift and leave that as a potential tax payment. But the reality is right now the IRS is not focused on that, but the IRS has targeted in the form you fill in to determine whether you are a covered expatriate is something called an 8854. They are going back and getting people. A very recent example is a guy named Roger Ver, who's known in the crypto community as Bitcoin Jesus, who expatriated in 2016, thought he'd be cute, lying on his 8854. Now he was arrested in Spain. He's out on bail, and he's looking at a $50 million tax bill. So if you're relying on the IRS to not find you as opposed to not being legally liable, it's great. It's a choice. I mean, lots of people were deciding that I'm going to not disclose my U.S. bank account at UBS, and it worked until it did.
Until it didn't, right? Yeah. Your house doesn't burn down until it burns down, right?
Right.
But wait, let me just ask a couple of questions about this, because it's an unfamiliar topic to many. So the actual liability is triggered only when the grantor dies, right? It operates like a regular inheritance tax. Or we're talking about that you're expatriating and you have an instrument where you're going to be granting, so there's a liability created on the date of expatriation.
So there's two things. So the 877A exit tax is a liability that is determined as of the day before
Okay.
you renounce or relinquish your long-term green card.
Okay.
So if you expatriate, for example, on April 1st of 1 year, you've determined what your tax bill is. You don't have to pay that amount until the following April. So there's some planning opportunities there. There's also some planning opportunities in the pre-expatriation tax planning. So for example, if you haven't used your unified credit and you've got 12.7 million, you can sit there and say, I'm going to put my highly appreciated assets to my U.S. children prior to my expatriating. You complete that proper gift in the year before you expatriate. So you're going to do that in 2024. You're going to use your unified credit, and you're going to expatriate in Q1 of 2025. You've triggered the tax bill on what you haven't done on your gifting.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of cute things that you can do. Can you use that to get you below the 2 million? Have you been in Puerto Rico and under Act 60, you've been driving down your federal tax liability over the last 5 years? So it gets complex. That, so for those who start with reading the white paper on my white, but, and organize these things. And one of the things is, have I been doing this a long time? Yes. Do I know a lot of stuff? Yes. Do I know everything? No. You have U.S. So in particular cases, they can get quite complex, but it's a wonderful tax savings. So doing it right, it's a great plan, tax-wise. Doing it wrong, you're going to step on a landmine. So we'll oftentimes bring in, so the co-author for the article for that white paper is a top U.S. tax lawyer, has been doing it for 45 years. I've been doing it for 34. So I always joke that he doesn't hold my youth and inexperience against me. But, we figure that. Are you going to go to Portugal? Okay, we're going to bring in Portuguese tax counsel. We're going to work with your family office. We're going to work with your investment advisor because they know what your succession plan is. They know, are you moving into a jurisdiction where the UK is great when the remittance space, it's also the divorce capital of the world. So what are the, tax is a percentage of income, divorce is a percentage of capital. So, I have 10-year-old twins, as I mentioned, a boy and a girl. Statistically, one of them is going to get divorced. I'd bet on my daughter because she already thinks the bad boys are cute. And so think of two future conversations that she may have. One is, honey, I know we're getting married in 2 weeks, but I need you to go to this lawyer and get independent legal advice on the prenuptial. Or, honey, it didn't work out. I'd love to give you half, but my father set it up in a trust when I was 7 years old, so you'll get half of nothing. So it's understanding who and having an integrated plan. Who are the different players that you need to have in order to make this successful? Great plan, if properly designed and executed. Terrible if you're not, because there's all kinds of, tax and family law and landmines that you can step on.
Yeah.
It's not a DIY project.
No, it doesn't sound like it. Now the actual, and you've got these great white papers that we'll link to. The actual process of renunciation, though, for U.S. citizens is fairly straightforward, right? It's just 2 appointments. I've even heard of people doing it in one. And what is that like for just briefly?
Sure. So you have to make an appointment at a U.S. mission. Embassies are in capitals. Consulates are in secondary cities outside of the U.S. So you have to do this outside of the U.S. During COVID, it was a real nightmare because a lot of these offices were closed. And so, I was flying people we were a couple of Silicon Valley people into New Zealand. The embassy was open. The trick was getting into New Zealand. Well, we had gotten them residence prior to COVID because they were all Tolkien fans, and New Zealand was a popular kind of place for a lot of wealthy Americans to kind of get a bolt hole. So that came in handy. But so getting Some offices are closed, are have big backlogs. Canadian offices, for example, in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal, you're looking at a 1.5 year waiting list. Well, if you want to get out sooner than that, so we may fly you to Reykjavik or Nassau or Buenos Aires. So knowing which offices don't have a backlog, getting you the appointment. There's a little bit of a trick in that. The second is the paperwork looks fairly straightforward, kind of tombstone information, but the key is understanding why that is being asked and what it means. And again, having done so many of these, I prepare the client for, this is what the officer needs to understand, and this is what they're getting at. A major problem, we got a client who, had retained a U.S. immigration lawyer who was great at bringing him in, well known, never done an expatriation. Told this fellow, well, you'd better stay out of the U.S. for the year before you expatriate so that the officer will allow you to expatriate. Didn't realize that giving up your U.S. citizenship, you're not asking the officer's permission. You're exercising a right. So long as you have capacity, so long as you're not under duress, you're exercising a right. So this fellow wasted a couple $100,000 flying around for the year before because the person didn't know that stuff. I mean, the number of expatriates, we're talking a couple tens of thousands. That's not a lot of number compared to the people coming into the U.S., for example. So they're a bit of a unicorn.
Right.
So you need to be somebody who's used to dealing with the unicorns and knowing all the tricks. So then we prepare them for the interview. We get them to the interview. They pay the fee, currently $2,350. It's supposed to drop to $400.
It's gone up in recent years.
Oh, it went up. It was $0.
Right.
Then it went up to $400. Then it went to $2,350. And then the U.S. government agreed in a lawsuit that they were going to drop it down to $400. But that was in January of 2022 or 2023. We're still waiting for them to gazette the number. But you pay that at the cashier, whether you do it yourself or you hire me.
Have they gone down to the lower number in practical terms?
They haven't yet. We're waiting for them to gazette. They promised to do it, and hopefully it'll be by the end of this year. They'll be back down to 400.
To discourage people, or?
Well, I actually did a core answer on this. So when we first started doing, when I was doing expatriations in the 1990s, there weren't a lot of them.
Right.
I could go into, I would go into U.S. Citizen Services in Toronto, and the locally engaged staff person who I knew quite well would always say, "Oh, here comes trouble." And, my clients would be fully prepared, and we'd go through the process, and that was it, and that was great. Well, then, as a result of FATCA, that number increased dramatically. So they said, well, we're getting a lot more of these. Let's figure out, what's our cost, and should people be paying for that? And that's when they got to 400. Then the General Accounting Office did another analysis, and they said, well, when we take into account the amount of time at the mission in Washington and reviewing all this, they did all the calculation and how much for the lights and how much for all this. They came out with $2,350, which was the highest amount in any country. And I think it came out from a bureaucrat, kind of came out with the number, but politicians said, oh, well, this would be good. They didn't challenge it because it did discourage people.
Right.
It didn't discourage my client who was looking to save millions. It discouraged kind of, little old lady in Calgary.
Right. Yeah. And so I understand there's really, it boils down to essentially two pieces of paper in the end. I mean, there's a memorandum kind of understanding where, you've discussed with the consular officer your motivations for making the renunciation, and there's sort of a checklist of points that they want you to acknowledge, and you sign, and I think they, notarize that. And then there's an actual oath where you essentially swear yourself out of the country.
Yeah, and there is a preliminary document
Right.
where they want to make sure that you're actually an American still to give up your U.S. citizenship. So they go through, have you done a previously expatriating act with the intention of giving up your U.S. citizenship at that point. And so they determine first, if I got an American across the street from me, I'll understand from their demeanor, their age, for example, nobody's behind them with a gun, under duress. Do they understand what they're doing? That's the memorandum of understanding. If you exercise this right, madam or sir, these are the ramifications of that. And one of the ramifications is you may not lose your tax liability, which is accurate, because if you give up your U.S. citizenship and then you go and live in the United States and spend too much time there, you're still going to be a U.S. person for tax purposes, except now you're going to be under a substantial presence test, not as a U.S. citizen. So, there, and one of the big things is something called the Reed Amendment. So again, way back in history, 1996, the U.S. was doing a major immigration reform. The U.S. passes legislation in these big quarterly omnibus bills that won. Back then, the major chunk of it was the immigration bill, but there was the funding for Yellowstone Rangers and everything that's in these quarterly bills. And Representative Reed came in and said, "Oh, well, as a result of a Forbes article called "The New Refugees," the previous November, we're going to, if you leave, you can't come back." So they drafted this thing, and back then it would be under the AG, who is Janet Reno. This was the Clinton administration. Janet Reno was the AG, and somebody on her staff goes, "Well, that's kind of unconstitutional." So they kind of put it aside. And then when they were running the kind of last version, they threw it back in. 3 readings of the House, 3 readings of the Senate, Thursday, Friday. President's going to sign it on Monday in order to fund the government on Tuesday morning. And one of my clients looked through and go, "Oh my God, they threw the Reed Amendment back in." So I was on a bunch of conference calls that weekend. Does somebody, ask Clinton to do a line-by-line veto? And we thought, no, that would be like Streisand effect.
Yeah.
So we woke up with the Reed Amendment and things. But there were a number of ways of getting around it because it was poorly drafted, etc. But there were only 2 attempts. It's all in Wikipedia. There were 2 attempts to actually enforce it. I got called in on one of those cases. And it was, a fund manager, I think probably somewhere on the spectrum, and came into the United States and said, "Oh, sir, you give up your U.S. citizenship. Did you do that for tax purposes?" "Yeah." So I'm going to ask you again specifically. "Did you relinquish your U.S. citizenship for the purpose of avoiding taxation?" "Yeah." "Well, then I'm going to exclude you today."
Exactly.
And that then went back to this case, and we came back, and a now retired Ed Bedencourt, who was the State Department, said, "Oh my God, somebody's trying to actually enforce this," and it ended up getting the client in. And again, 1996, we're now coming up on almost 30 years.
Yes.
2 early attempts to enforce it. So it's a toothless tiger. But lots of people still say, "Oh, if I give up my U.S. citizenship, I can't go back." The reality is, do I need a visa? Well, what passport do you have? You either need a visa or a U.S. visa waiver program and an ESTA, or you're Canadian or Bermudian, you don't even need a visa to enter the United States. And again, when I was going through law school, before I either saw the light or went to the dark side and got called to the bar in 1990, I actually worked for the Canadians as a port of entry official. And I like to say to my clients, it's almost like the immigration guy is going to say, "Come on in," and the IRS is behind them whispering, "And we hope you stay too long." So the problem is not getting in. The problem is properly advised and having the proper visas. The problem is not getting in. The problem is triggering tax liability by physical presence.
Right. So the Reed Amendment put that Section 212A, whatever section it is, into the Immigration and Nationality Act, that you're inadmissible if you have previously renounced or relinquished citizenship for tax avoidance purposes.
No.
No? That's a different.
If you have previously relinquished.
Okay.
So what we were doing is getting clients a new citizenship, or sorry, it said renounce. We're getting a new citizenship and saying, okay, you've just taken on citizenship, insert name of citizenship by investment country. And you have declared that when you did that, you intended to lose your U.S. citizenship. So you relinquished.
Okay.
Reed Amendment only dealt with renunciation.
Great. Yeah.
So in the early years, we were getting clients who already had another citizenship that they felt comfortable. We would just buy whatever one it was and then say, okay, they relinquish. They took out citizen. They became naturalized in insert name of country yesterday, and they intended to lose their U.S. citizenship. So they relinquished, and the Reed Amendment didn't apply. Then eventually we stopped doing that because
it
the
became
Reed
a
Amendment.
red letter, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, they never passed enabling regulations, and of course, 9/11 happened, and then you got something called Homeland Security, and was no longer under the AG and things, and now 28 years have passed.
Mm-hmm. Understood. I mean, what other considerations, if any, should someone make before they make the decision to renounce? I mean, we've talked about the taxation considerations. We've talked about the fact that you're going to be treated, as an alien for purposes of U.S. But I mean, for most people who don't have other grounds of inadmissibility, just the fact that they renounced is not going to stop them from getting back into the U.S. Are there any other considerations they need to take into account?
Well, it was just dropped by SCOTUS yesterday, and I haven't had a chance to read the Moore case. I've read, and so the Moore versus the United States was a Supreme Court of Canada decision, or Supreme Court of the United States decision that was dropped on June 20th of 2024. We're now taping this on the 21st. And the question there was, it dealt with guilty tax. It dealt with taxing unrealized income, but it was really, is it constitutional to tax unrealized capital gains? And they kind of, as so far as I understand it, they kind of tried to, in a Solomon-like way, kind of split the baby. And so, depending on if you're listening to, Elizabeth Warren, she's saying, oh, we can tax unrealized capital gains now. We can bring in the ultra millionaire tax or the billionaire tax. But if they said it's unconstitutional, well, that Section 877A exit tax would be unconstitutional, which means you depart, you don't have to pay, you don't have a deemed disposition. So if you're somebody like Elon Musk, who's already got a Canadian and a South African passport, and who doesn't need to remain in the U.S. to make and maintain his wealth, he could leave without triggering a capital gain. So, so those types of considerations you have to watch. I would say, in the last few years, 4 out of 5 of my clients are getting fire insurance and a fire escape plan, not for tax purposes, but because they're worried about non-tax issues. I mean, I grew up, across in Windsor, Ontario, when Detroit was known as Murder City. But back then it was, 2 drug dealers shooting at each other with Saturday night specials. Now you got randos walking in with AR-15s into places of worship and bowling alleys and movie theaters and playgrounds and concerts. And so I had a client, wealthy guy, could have been going for tax. He said, no, my main motivation is the gun violence is just out of control. And he said, I know statistically my children aren't going to be part of a mass shooting event, but I know with 100% certainty that they're going to go through active shooter drills. I know with 100% certainty, at least once a month, I'm going to have to talk them down because they saw on TikTok or the news somebody who looks like their best friend who was just killed. And I know with 100% certainty, every time they go out for soccer practice or to McDonald's with their friends, my wife and I are going to be wondering, is today the day?
You're worried sick.
And so there's that. Anti-Semitism has been a big thing. I had one client who his friend said, well, yeah, anti-Semitism is rising all over the world. And his response was, yeah, but the anti-Semites in the U.S. are armed with AR-15s. Political polarization. I've got lots of clients who've gotten a go-bag option who've just said, we are not going to be here from the beginning of November until after the swearing in. We don't know what's going to happen, and we just plan. We're going to go for 3 months to Italy.
Yeah, no, I know a lot of people who've actually said that personally. That for that little period, it's going to, no matter what happens, no matter what the outcome is, it's going to be a lot of conflict and contested and a lot of discord, and they just don't want to be present and witness all that, and for the who knows what moments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying I'm de Tocqueville. I mean, I was explaining to you earlier, the only reason I don't have a U.S. citizenship is because my parents had incompatible blood, and my birth had to take place in Canada. But I've been watching, as PBS would say, the American experience for a long time. I've spent more hours watching Ken Burns documentaries than I care to think about. And so I've been watching the U.S. for quite a while. I've never seen it in this kind of case. I wish them the best, but I once had somebody, she thought it was an insult, I thought it was untrue but aspirational, say, David, you look at the world like Mr. Spock. Thank you. I try, but
Worst
probably
things
fail.
Wow.
Yeah, and things and stuff. And so when I look at the U.S. right now, I can see why. And I have clients who hire me and who, they spend money and time on people like me because they have real concerns that fighting the fire is not going to be enough. And they want just the comfort and the optionality. They hope they never need to use the fire insurance or the fire escape plan, but it gives them comfort that they're protecting their family wealth and well-being by having that fire insurance and a fire escape plan.
Absolutely. And David, that's a really good point to start to wrap up our program, because it used to be this whole topic and all this discussion, and you're such an expert. It's amazing, really one of the preeminent experts. But this entire thing used to be a fairly exotic topic that a very small number of people were really concerned about. And it's not anymore. This is something that is a topic that has really come into the mainstream, and a lot of people, whether they're digital nomads, people want to work from wherever, or retirees. I mean, more and more American retirees are going abroad for their retirement. So on that note, I really want to thank you for sharing with us your enormous expertise on this topic. And we're going to continue to follow the trends in this space. And hopefully, you'll agree to come back and share more. We can maybe delve into some of these specific topics in greater depth.
I would be my greatest pleasure.
Okay. David Lesperance, founder of Lesperance and Associates, a multinational law firm, joining us today from Poland. David, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, James.